This is the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour. Interviews with writers on KPFA's nationally syndicated Bookwaves program, along with interviews about film and theater and archive book interviews that stretch back 4 decades. I'm your host, Richard Wolinsky. We start today's program with a theater review, Pictures from Home, which plays at Marin Theater through this coming Sunday. We don't air reviews during fund drives, so this one had to wait until nearly the end of the run. The bulk of today's program is a new interview with British novelist and essayist John Lanchester, discussing his latest novel, Look What You Made Me Do, along with his essays in The Guardian and elsewhere about the pitfalls of AI. The show concludes with a review of Dracula, a feminist revenge fantasy, really, by Kate Hamill, which runs at San Francisco Playhouse through June 27th. The KPFA fund drive may be over, and we fell short of our goal. This is still a great time to support listener-sponsored, fiercely independent media with our gifts available at least through the weekend. KPFA is in its 77th year. We survive and have survived all these years due to listener contributions. Please support us by donating at kpfa.org. Let's keep KPFA alive for another 77 years or more. One other thing this coming weekend's highlight is the Bay Area Book Festival, with readings, interviews, discussions, and more all over Berkeley on Saturday, May 30th and Sunday, May 31st. For a complete listing of events and times and days, please go to baybookfest.org. That's baybookfest, one word, .org. As usual, you can find updated links and listings to bookstore and live theater venues by clicking on the link at the top of today's Bookwaves, Artwaves page at kpfa.org. You can also find a link to the same list by going to the Bay Area Theater podcast page, also at kpfa.org, where you can read and hear the latest theater reviews. Coming up now, the first of 2 Bookwaves, Artwaves theater reviews. Acclaimed photographer Larry Sultan based his career on capturing life as lived through his art, and what better notion than collating photos of his own family and home growing up in Sherman Oaks in Southern California during the middle of the 20th century. This collection of snapshots became a book published in 1992, which was then adapted for the stage as Pictures from Home, which plays at Marin Theater through May 31st. In this memory play, Larry, who died in 2009, tells the story of his visits to his parents while preparing the book, as the 3, parents and son, comment on the pictures and bicker with one another. Irving Sultan, the retired salesman, is no Willy Loman. He sold well and retired well off, always ready to explain exactly what makes a great salesman, often to Larry's chagrin. Jean Sultan, ever acerbic, puts up with her husband's toxic masculinity, refusing to take his bullying and having a life of her own. Always seemingly on the verge of divorce, they will stay together until the end. What makes Pictures from Home work so well in this Marin Theater production, the show began off-Broadway in 2023 with a cast that included Nathan Lane, is the truthfulness in the dialogue and all 3 performances, and in the direction of Jonathan Moscone. There's no heightened speech, no pregnant theatrical pauses. These are real people sounding like a family. Dysfunctional, maybe, but real. The performances by Victor Talmadge as Irving and Susan Kuzin as Jean are so truthful that even if they're not your actual parents or grandparents, they still sound like them in their sparring and quarreling. Dan Cantor, as the narrator and son, physically a dead ringer for the real Larry, pulls off his double duties without a hitch. Pictures from Home can at times be painful to watch. These people are maybe too real for comfort. Do you really want to spend an evening with relatives like this? Didn't you move so far away from them as possible? Our memories create golden ages where such squabbles and power plays don't exist, which is why Larry Sultan's photos have such resonance. His photos were more credible than the memories he retained, which is why his books and exhibitions work so well. This play mirrors that credibility. With truthfulness in short supply these days in social media and in news reports, finding it in a memory play is all the more special. Pictures from Home by Shar White, directed by Jonathan Moscone, plays at Marin Theatre through May 31st, and for more information, you can go to marintheatre.org. I'm Richard Wolinsky on Bay Area Theatre for KPFA. My guest is John Lanchester, whose latest novel is Look What You Made Me Do. There are 6 novels in all. There's one collection of short stories, 4 works of nonfiction as well. John Lanchester writes several essays about the economy, about AI, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to go back. I interviewed you for The Wall back in 2019, before the pandemic, before Brexit. You wrote this dystopian novel about a future Britain walled off, rising seas, and then we had events occur. From your perspective today, would you have written the same novel now?
I guess not. I mean, in a way, it was a vain ambition, but part of what I was hoping was that I would help prevent a future by describing it. I'd sort of sketch out this thing that would look so horrible that people would think, hang on, what path are we on here? You know, how can we get off this trajectory? And instead, it's gone the other way around. And a thing that I frequently hear when people talk about that book is they say, you know, it's getting more and more true every day. I mean, I recently, just yesterday, a friend sent me a clip, a news clip of some idiot suggesting that in the English Channel that they start putting floating mines to stop small boats crossing, which is, you know, one of the obsessive things in our politics in the moment. It's the equivalent of your illegal immigration, but here it comes in the form of boats coming across the channel. And obviously that's the stupidest idea anyone has ever had, because it's the busiest stretch of water in the world. The idea of mining it is like really dumb, but as an indication of the way that the whole conversation has shifted and taken this really dark turn, it was a bit of an indicator.
Did it work on any level? I mean, you wrote this, and then things have just gotten progressively worse. And as you say, it's almost as if you were predicting a little bit what we're starting to see now. What would you have done differently? What would you have said differently? Anything?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't use the rear view mirror much. I think more about what I'm writing now than what I wrote, you know, a year ago, and let alone previous books. But it's a chronicle of defeat, really. But that's happened to me before. I mean, I got very interested in. I wrote a novel set in London around the financial crash, and I got interested as a sort of spin-off in that, in the way that finance and economics works, in just a very simple way. Because I realized when I was working on the book that finance is the thing that has really changed the economy of the UK in the last couple of decades. And in a literal, granular way, it was who my neighbours were. I mean, I was writing about a London street and realised that actually one of the crucial things about it was that, I mean, not as a metaphor, literally, finance was determining who they were, because they all worked on the what we call the City of London, the equivalent of your Wall Street. And so I got interested in it, and then the crash happened, and I suddenly found that, you know, I was telling a story about this thing that was suddenly the biggest story in the world. And I took an interest from a fairly cold start in finance and economics, and found out more about it and ended up writing more about it. I wrote a book called IOU about the crash, and then another book about the language of economics called How to Speak Money. And part of my plan or program was that it would have a demystifying effect and maybe slightly a radicalizing effect if people pulled back the curtain a little bit and just saw, as it were, the language that Davos man speaks. tools that we use, and things like, to say specifically quantitative easing, one example, which is baffling thing that no one had heard of before the financial crash, and turned out, and I got a big fight with an economist who's saying that I'd said that we end up paying for it. He said, no, of course you don't pay for it. That's not how this works at all. You don't pay it. And in fact, we are paying for it very directly in asset prices having got out of control, which specifically means house prices, which in turn specifically means it's harder and harder for young people to just get that initial start in life. So I put quite a lot of time and energy into that project, and basically I'd say that had absolutely no effect at all, because what I thought was going to happen was that there would be some form of financial crash part 2 that would throw into our politics and economics and sociology, and people would get gradually angrier, and they would think, okay, we're no alternative, we have to do things like this. But actually, in fact, there are alternatives. There are other ways of constructing economies. We're not trapped. We can envisage alternatives. And I thought, as I say, the economics would blow up first and the politics would follow. And that was the wrong way round. In fact, it was the politics and sociology and people's sense of themselves that really shifted. And then, in a funny way, economics is irrelevant now. Who cares what Davos man thinks? The radicalizing force all through the developed world, across the developed world, has been a kind of new kind of politics, when it says, I don't care what you say the economics are, these are the things we want. Identity and culture and a sense of belonging have proved to be much more important to people than just Davos man's economic view of things.
John Lanchester, getting back to Look What You Made Me Do. Okay, so 2019 comes, the book comes out. Meanwhile, you've been writing these ghost stories that were collected over the course of several years, I would think, kind of Black Mirror-ish. And that's Reality and Other Stories, which came out 2020, I think.
It did. At the risk of sounding slightly insane, I don't particularly like short stories, and I hardly ever read them. So I was very surprised to find myself writing a whole collection of them. I wrote poetry as a teenager, and it kind of came slightly unbidden. Wrote it for a few years and then stopped. And the short stories were slightly like that. Like, it wasn't a plan or anything. I just wrote one, had one idea, and then another idea came, and another idea came, and then I can't remember, I think there's 6 or 7 in that collection, and realized after putting them together that they kind of had a theme about, whether reality is really real, which is a great interest. We talked about it last time, a writer we both hugely admire, Philip K. Dick. It was a sort of separate thing. And then it came out in this really strange moment. It came out right in the depth of the pandemic in October, in the fall of 2020. And, here in this country, we'd just come out of lockdown, and it was clear we were going back into lockdown. And so it was it was the strangest publication process I've ever had. It was like a kind of delirium. And it was the first time I did events virtually. And it was just something so odd about having this book out that was about whether reality is real, and feeling that actually in the present tense, something had actually shifted in the nature of reality. I don't know, there was something so odd about, having a book come out at a point when, it was, I don't know, it was the last thing on my mind, it was the last thing on anybody's mind. Who wants to read a bunch of ghost stories at a point when, we all feel like ghosts anyway?
I was thinking back, and I've been thinking back after avoiding thought of what that year was like. A lot of things changed for everyone, and the politics in America, at least, post pandemic, are all related in some respect to the pandemic. Without a pandemic, I suspect Donald Trump would be ancient history.
Yeah, it definitely had a deranging effect and an unmooring effect. I mean, I think I link to that, though, there's something strange, that there's very little art about it in any medium. And it might be that not enough time has passed, but I wonder, if you look back at the First World War, what they at the time used to call the Great War, you think of the First World War. First World War has a convulsive impact in literature, in music, in the plastic arts, sculpture, painting. There's a profound memoir, poetry, everything. There's a profound impact right across the board on the art of the whole Western world. But the flu pandemic killed more people. The flu pandemic of 1919, Spanish flu it was called, killed more people. And there's nothing about that. There's a complete cultural void about that. It's as if people couldn't process it. It's as if you can't make art about something that seems, I don't know what it is, sort of like time out of time, or time when we're all shut down or hiding from the world or something. I mean, it just is really strange if you juxtapose the First World War with this thing that killed more people. Lots of art about one thing, nothing about the other. And I wonder if the pandemic has a similar thing that, we're just struggling to process it. And one of the signs of us struggling to process it is, where's the art? I think it's come out in our societies in other ways, pretty much entirely negative.
You're listening to an interview with John Lanchester, whose latest novel is Look What You Made Me Do. I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour. I read something the other day that actually said that more soldiers, American soldiers, died from the flu during World War I than they did in combat. And yet, this was a fact that maybe I'd heard it before and not registered it, but it felt almost like a new fact. And we're talking a century later. At that point, your book had come out. Had you started thinking about your next novel? What was John Lanchester's thoughts at that particular time? Had you begun pondering this kind of book of puzzle boxes that is Look What You Made Me Do?
No, I mean, I can't remember what I was thinking, but the whole, it was a really strange thing. The whole book came to me one morning after getting out of bed within 2 minutes. And the reason I can be so precise is I've got one of those electric toothbrushes that has a 2-minute timer. It buzzes every 30 seconds, front, back,
Right.
down. And it just like popped in my head. The whole, which the story has various twists and turns, as you know, but the whole plot came in one go, and that must mean that on some level I had been cooking it up. That there'd been some unconscious process to do with some of the themes in it, because in order for it to arrive so fully formed, I must have been working on it quite hard for quite a long time. But none of that was sort of in the daylight. It was properly strange. I mean, including up to the level of having the last sentence.
Really?
Yeah. There'd obviously been a thing of this long gestation period, and then it arrived fairly fully formed in about, I'd say, maybe 22. I'd say is when I started working on it.
It feels as if every part of the book, every aspect of the book is so specifically placed that by the time I came to the end of the book, I felt like an idiot for not having figured anything out. And then I thought about it and realized it was all very deliberate, that the point of it was complete misdirection. I'm wondering how much of that part of it was conscious.
Very much so. I mean, the fun of the book in writing it and the challenge were about what I found when I finished it and handed it over to my editor. What I found myself calling the mechanism, the plot mechanism of, as you say, misdirection, setting things up one way and it going another way. And in my head, it's a psychological thriller. By the way, isn't what the publisher. So I handed it over to the publisher. He said, "What is it?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe you'll tell me." But it's a kind of psychological thriller. So he disappeared, came back about a week later and said, it's not a psychological thriller. It's a black comedy about intergenerational resentment."
Which
Okay,
it
fine.
is.
It's a black
Fine.
comedy about intergenerational resentment. But in terms of writing it, because I thought of it as a psychological thriller, I was very conscious of using thriller elements in the structure. And the two main structural things in a thriller are suspense and surprise, and they're kind of the opposite. And Hitchcock described very vividly, Alfred Hitchcock, the way suspense works in the book. So you have like two men sitting across a table having a conversation about some random thing, and it just seems like a random conversation. You show the same conversation between the same men, but before it, you see someone else come in the room and put a bomb under the table and then go out, and you watch that apparently inconsequential conversation right on the edge of your seat because you're waiting for the bomb to go off. And as Hitchcock said, the bomb must never go off. That's suspense. And then surprise is the opposite, in that you have this thing that you haven't been anticipating, that you haven't seen coming, that seems to come completely out of left field in a different direction, but that as soon as it does happen, it feels completely satisfying and retrospectively makes sense of things. And those are the two things I was super conscious that, you know, the alternation between those and the tension between those two elements were the thing that was, you know, both the challenge and the fun of writing it.
Well, that was, I guess, my first question about was it intentional had to do more with that original toothbrush thought. On the surface, we are talking about a satire about contemporary life in Britain with a comic twist in that it appears that private thoughts, private comments by a couple are suddenly popping up in a Netflix TV series. And I can say that it's on the jacket. And yet, that is all going on at the same time. And we're reading it as an amusing contemporary satire. But as I was finished, I thought, my God, this is like he's assembled a house of cards or something. Everything is in place to make me feel constantly be hitting my head going, oh my God, of course. And going back to the beginning to find the clues.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, that was what I was very interested in writing. I mean, I you need kind of different help with different books, I think. With this one, I did, you know, I was so marinated it by the time I finished that I did. My wife always reads it first, and she's very quick
Well, she's a
on.
mystery writer too.
She's written mysteries herself too,
Yeah,
and history. And she's, you know, if you're watching something on the sofa at home on the TV, and you kind of get to the end of the episode of something, and I say, hey, do you think, I wonder if that guy is actually the person who, and she, oh, for God's sake, John, that's been perfectly obvious for half an hour. You know, she's always way ahead. She's very, very, very quick with that kind of plot. And so she was a really useful person to have reading it, and you know, scribbled in the margin at various points. By this point, I have realized, you know, she'd say, and that was super helpful, as I think, because you sometimes, there's a rather good description by the late great Michael Crichton, so that you start out with a book, you start out wanting to build a boat, and then you get to work on the boat, and you get preoccupied with the details of, you know, where the mast goes, what the bowsprit looks like, what the steering wheel looks like, paint, you know, scrubbing the deck, arranging the rudder, and you can't see it anymore. And then you hand it over to the editor, and the editor is the person who says, well, the thing about this boat is, you know, that needs to be there and that needs to be there, and that's the person who can actually see it.
great.
And I did need help from Miranda and also from my editor into those things about exactly what you've been talking about, is when things land and when things hit, and what the audience and the reader takes and when they take it. And that, as I said, that was the fun part, really.
Right now, as we're talking, a friend of mine, a millennial, is reading the book, and he got to a certain point where there's a shift in the first person narration. At that point, he goes, oh, I didn't think that was going to happen.
As I say, that's the sort of surprise suspense thing, and that was, you know, the whole thing with the project, from thinking about two different narrators and a story told from two different perspectives, and at the beginning you don't know what they have to do with each other at all, and then the pattern gradually becomes clear, and the psychological thriller is in effect the contest between these two women, Kate, who's what Bridget Jones would have called a smug married in the latter part of her 50s, and Phoebe, who's a young screenwriter in her 30s. The book is kind of, someone described it as a revenge comedy. The question is, who's getting revenge on who and for what? And I think the other thing in it, I think one of the important contests in life is who gets to tell the story.
Right.
Happens in history, happens in politics, happens in personal relationships. Is that great? One of Marge Simpson's great lines in The Simpsons said to her daughter Lisa, she says, Lisa, marriage is a beautiful thing, but it's also a lifelong contest for the moral upper hand. And you know, this book is that it's a contest for the upper hand, and particularly the thing about two narrators, and they're fighting over whose story it is and who gets to tell it.
Interspersed with brief segments from the TV show. Again, the question is, why are they there? And you're creating more misdirection by doing that.
There's a kind of blurring between the fictional version and what the characters know has actually happened. I mean, one of the, I mentioned earlier this thing about, in order for it to come very quickly, I must have been thinking about it for a long time. And one of the sort of starting points for me is, or two really, they're linked. And one, many years ago, I did a thing for The Guardian about Edward Snowden and had access to the Snowden papers, which at that point were in New York. And it really struck me the extent to which certain kinds of intrusion have got, the possibility of intrusion in our lives has gone to a completely different level from anything that human beings have ever known before. I mean, it's always been, the state can get a warrant and open your letters, tap into your phone. That's always been true. But because of the ubiquity of electronic devices, which are always on and they're absolutely everywhere, there's now, and the example I had in mind, if you had a private nickname for your partner or a loved one that you'd never spoken in front of another person, that's now something that the state could know if it had hacked all the relevant devices. And that's a new thing. And it draws the boundary around our self differently. The kind of the limitations of our private space, the kind of parameter of our selfhood is I think slightly different. What you can reliably and certainly know for a fact is only yours. That line's different now. And so that was one of the things that I was interested in, this thing about about sort of that blurring, that the weakening of that sort of cordon around the self. And then the other thing was I was on an underground train, in the tube train here. And again, this was about a decade ago, and the compartments are quite small. And there were 5 people in there reading Game of Thrones. Do this one quite small carriage. I remember thinking, wow, that is a new thing. We've always had moments where, there are phenomena that are kind of everywhere at the same time in the culture. But that's really gone to a new level now. You can have a thing that is absolutely everywhere simultaneously. Everybody's reading it or watching it or whatever. And those were the two starting points, I think. That I was just interested in that thing of a tension between something that was completely private, you thought, but that was completely ubiquitous. I wasn't aware that I'd been sitting on that idea, thinking about it for 10 years, but in fact, it turned out I had.
Which makes me think, based upon your writing about AI more recently, that something probably has to be going on in your head for a novel, but it may come out in a toothbrush in a year.
So, I mean, I've never quite known, when I write pieces, essays, journalism, nonfiction, it feels like a very different impulse from writing novels, in that, it's a thing that, the way I put it is that I can write pieces about anything that I'm interested in. It's like something in the world, oh, that's interesting, I write about. Whereas novels are slightly harder to explain. They kind of come from a different place, and it's like an idea sort of plucks at your sleeve, and you can't quite understand why it's plucking at your sleeve. You're going to ignore it, and then it plucks at your sleeve a bit more, and you ignore it again, it plucks again. And eventually you think, well, there's something about that just that book wants to be written. I can't quite explain why, but it just does. And in the end, I've come to trust that impulse on the basis that if there's something about an idea that I can't quite explain away, or can't quite, stop thinking about, that's sort of bugging me and just stays with me, that I have to hope that if it has that effect on me, maybe it'll have that effect on the reader too.
John Lanchester, getting back to Look What You Made Me Do, there is also the satirical element where you are setting it very specifically in a contemporary area. From your perspective, is that fully misdirection, or are you also at the same time doing something else?
Iris Murdoch once said, there's an awful lot of stuff in a novel. And the more fully realized the world, I always thought, the more believable the characters, that you need some granularity in the setting to make it come alive. And it's kind of boomer v millennial, and it's set in London. I think the crucial thing for the story is more the age gap. It doesn't have to be, it could be Gen X versus versus Gen Z. That age gap would work just as well, and it could be, you know, Oakland or Chicago as well as London. But the kind of animating detail does come from that particular setting. I think the kind of intergenerational element in the book is, to be honest, it's pretty much the same everywhere in the developed world. That particular thing about, you know, one generation having it fairly, from the other's point of view, having it fairly easy. It's just they argue about which way around that goes to see who's the most entitled.
Which is another essay that you talk about, and which we'll get to in a minute. The other element is that the first person narrators are women, to a point where my friend kept going, is John Lanchester a woman or a gay man or something? Because it feels like it was written by a woman. Now, I would assume you worked with your wife on some of that to make sure you had it right.
To be honest, no. It sounds a bit pretentious to say my process, but, you know, the way I write my books is I don't talk about them while I'm doing them, because although I'd often quite like to, but the thing is, I find there's something incredibly helpful about having what I call a clean reading, that the first response to my wife in the first instance, and then maybe my editor, don't know a single thing about it. That it hasn't been described to them. It's completely clean, cold, out of the blue, no context. And I just find that incredibly helpful. And then basically what happens is everybody after that has had it described to them in some form, even if it's just the flat copy of the book, the jacket copy, or if it's a recommendation or whatever. But in terms of getting it the way I want it to be, I just really need that thing of someone who doesn't know what's coming. I kind of depend on it. So no, we didn't cook it up. I didn't talk about it while I was doing it, but I mean, her feedback was very helpful. But the thing about, I mean, in the famous 2-minute toothbrush thing, it was those characters right from the start. It wasn't like, I felt there was a story I could tell in 3 different ways with, you know, different combinations of characters, that they were kind of there right from the off. And in a weird way, although there are 2 women narrators, in a strange sense, the protagonist is a man. There's a man in the middle between them, Kate's husband, Jack. I was very conscious of the fact that you could almost say Jack's the main character, or Jack is the inciting incident, or Jack is the kind of fulcrum around whom the story revolves. So I was sort of, yes, it's 2 women telling the story backwards and forwards, but there is a kind of, it's not exactly a love triangle, but there's a man really at the center of it.
You're listening to an interview with John Lanchester, whose latest novel is Look What You Made Me Do. I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour. The part that I'm driving at here is that it's a subtle thing. Books, and this is, of course, anecdotal for me as a man, but I've noticed that books written by women, not always, I want to keep that in mind, and certainly not always the same with men either, tend to be more introspective than books written by men. There's a lot more thinking, a lot more pondering by women than by men. And it's in your book, and I'm reading it and I'm going, this feels like it was written by a woman on an unconscious level.
I take that as a great compliment. Thank you. I mean, one of the things that happens is, so I had the story, as I said, this structure that came pretty quickly, and that gave me what they had to sound like. Kate and Phoebe, they had these stories to tell, and in order to tell them, they had to sound like a certain kind of person. And I've written novels in the first person before. What happened before is the same thing, is that you kind of, you know what you need the voice to be like. It's almost like a piece of algebra. You know, they have to fulfill requirements A and B to the power of C equals X. So Kate and Phoebe, the kind of narrative functions they had to fulfill, and I can know what they're out there somewhere. And then the process of getting the voice for me is sort of like in the days before digital radio, when you actually had to tune a radio in. It was like that. It's like, I know the frequency is out there somewhere. I've just got to keep tweaking the dial until I can pick it up and pick up the signal. And what happened, it took a little while, and then I got it. I could hear Kate in the first sentence of the book, In fact, it comes in her voice. Every successful marriage has its own private language. That's, it's like having suddenly tuned in the radio. Go, bang, got it. Got her. She's there. She's alive. It's not exactly like taking dictation, but actually, to be honest, it's not that different. It's like that person is there reading the book to you, and your job is just to get it down on the page. And then with Phoebe, again, there were the same set of sort of narrative constraints around her. I knew what I wanted her to do, that and that then brought with it as a corollary what I wanted her to sound like. And then I had this note of her character that I was really keen to pick up, which is, she's someone who, I think life is easier if you're pleasant and agreeable and nice to people, but that is not a universal view. There are people who like deliberately spiky, deliberately quite difficult, don't make things easy for other people. And there's this wonderful French word, pénible, P-E-I-N-I-B-L, pénible, and it means kind of being difficult on purpose, making every single interaction with them slightly harder than it needs to be, just on principle. And Phoebe's like that. Phoebe is pénible. And then once I kind of caught that in her voice, again, it was as if she was right there in the room talking to me. And that's very much how it works for me, that thing about just the plot conundrum, the story determines what their character needs to be like, and then it's the voice that actually unlocks their presence.
What you're describing in some ways sounds a lot like writing a play, in that
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I mean, I've never done it. I used to study Shakespeare when I was at university. That was one of my great passions. And I think it helps explain how Shakespeare did it. If you imagine he was writing for this cast that he knew very well, and he was just giving his pages to Richard Burbage, who played Hamlet, his pages to Ned Alling, who was another member of his company, and his pages for Feste, who was the Joker. He kind of could visualize and hear those words in someone else's mouth. So I do think there's an element of ventriloquism or sort of, I don't say possession, but yeah, I mean, the more like real people they are that you're kind of, as we're handing a script to, I think the more likely it is to come alive. Having said that, there are no rules about writers' processes. Everybody does it a different way.
I've talked to writers who have said the process for them book to book is different, let alone writer to writer.
Yeah, true.
John Lanchester, I want to talk a little bit about AI, which is on everyone's mind. And now that you've moved your interest from finance to AI, one thing you said in finance in one of your articles was that 3 ways of becoming rich are inherit the money, marry the money, or steal it. Where do you think Elon Musk or Sergey Brin fit in there? Steal it? Do we now have gambling?
Steal would be closest, I suppose, but I think I'd say the 3 easiest or the 3 simplest or the 3 most traditional. I mean, inventing new things is, that's a good way of doing it too. It's a lot less straightforward. It's a lot harder than the traditional methods.
One thing I noticed in your reviewing these books on OpenAI, Sam Altman and the guy from NVIDIA as well, is that this idea that not only are they good at creating something that makes them a lot of money, but suddenly this idea that they're good at everything and we should just offer them control, the Peter Thiel view of these tech giants. And I'm just wondering how that fits into what we're seeing. Is there any difference between that and Andrew Carnegie, maybe?
I'm not sure I know enough about Carnegie. I mean, he didn't half endow a lot of libraries. I don't see an equivalent of that in this generation. I think there is a tendency, you must see a lot of it out where you live, of people who've done well in the tech sphere thinking that they're all conquering overlords of all human thought. That's always been around a little bit in finance. I think in finance that because most transactions are binary, there's a winner and a loser. If you win a few times, then people think that, well, that's the same as being proved right. And if you've been proved right, that's the same as being right about everything. So that it's not new, that thing about mild or maybe not necessarily so mild form of delusions of intellectual grandeur. I think the new thing is just the scale, because that thing about unquantifiable, unconscionable amounts of wealth that people and their descendants, couldn't conceivably spend in 10 generations or 100 lifetimes. That is a new thing, and maybe also the scale of the delusions kind of matches the scale of the money. I mean, I noticed though, someone pointed this out the other day about Teal, that he said this famous thing about democracy and freedom not being compatible, and this realization that had come to him, and realizing whoever made this point, I wish I could remember who it was, but what he means by that is he means freedom for him. It means democracy isn't compatible with him being able to do exactly what he wants all the time. And yeah, hell yeah, it's not. It's not compatible with that for any of us. And it's interesting to have reached a point where there's this sort of degradation in the discourse that allows people to be that far gone, than to think, well, I made a lot of money, therefore I ought to be able to do whatever the hell I like. You get as we speak, there's that trial going on about the OpenAI switching to a non-profit. You get glimpses of it in the testimony people are giving there, that their kind of unwillingness to accept rules, basically rules or norms, or the idea that there are constraints on their behavior. That's a pretty basic thing. That's the thing that people have normally learned. If they haven't learned it on day one of kindergarten, they've learned it by the end of kindergarten.
And
it seems it doesn't apply to these guys.
Teal has been going around giving these seminars about the Antichrist and all that. And I listened to a little of something that had been captured, and there was an interview by Russ Douthat in the Times, New York Times, and I realized listening to Teal that it was incoherent nonsense. And yet all of these people are sitting around listening to this when it's clearly nonsense.
Yeah, it's embarrassing. The one really funny thing that came out of it, I mean, because presumably in Teal's case, it was a sort of joke that got out of hand. He was sort of trolling. So what would Antichrist look like? It would look like world government, or what would world government look like? Where it would look like Greta Thunberg. Therefore, maybe Greta Thunberg is the Antichrist. I mean, that's a joke. And then he sort of it gets out of hand. He turns it into this series of lectures that people either take seriously or pretend to take seriously. But there was a quite funny moment in some interview where someone said, but actually, if you read the Bible, Peter, aren't you more like the Antichrist? And Teal being kind of visibly, not, I mean, because that's a kind of amazingly obvious thought. Every single person watching and listening to it goes to you straight away. Him or Greta, which is it more likely to be? Well, duh. But it never occurred to him.
On AI itself, which I did an interview with a tech writer, used to be a tech writer for the Wall Street Journal, Vahini Vara, about a year ago. And she kept calling what we call AI just simply product, because that's all it is. And I noticed in the end that you make some really great points. One is that calling an AI error hallucination is simply another kind of salesmanship, as is the doomerism of AI, which turns it into Terminator, let's say. That all of this is just hype.
An enormous amount of it is. I mean, the hallucination thing is that, the implicit piece of salesmanship in that, if an entity hallucinates, then it has consciousness. You have to have consciousness to be able to hallucinate. But, a fridge can't hallucinate, a toaster can't hallucinate, and an AI can't hallucinate because they don't have consciousness. What an AI can do is make mistakes, but that's a different thing. It's a less interesting, less sexy, less glamorous, less dangerous idea if it's just getting stuff wrong, which, as we all know, it does absolutely all the time. I mean, I'm having a run of things at the moment. I've been reading Anthony Trollope, 19th century novelist, and there are various points where the kind of political history is slightly opaque, using AI to check both it and me, the understanding of it. And it's terrible. It gets things wrong all the time. And asking about particular characters, and it was saying the exact opposite of what had just happened on the page I had just read. So so and there's a big argument about the ballot, meaning the secret ballot. I mean, actually, the argument's quite interesting because I'd never thought of the other side of it. Well, what possible arguments could there be against the secret ballot? And it actually turns quite an interesting thing in the time. It's that people should be able to publicly assert, if you take a view, you should stand by it. And therefore having a public ballot force, well, it's an interesting idea. Long gone as an idea, but it's quite an interesting thought. But anyway, I was looking at the thing about which characters were on which side of the thing, and it just flatly 100% opposite of the page I was, holding in front of my face. So it's still doing that, but they're not hallucinations; they're just mistakes. The Doomer thing is, P.T. Barnum-esque. It's going to kill us all. It's going to kill us all. Roll up, and ask it what your favorite apple tart recipe is.
John Lanchester, since I didn't get the book, I looked up your short story collection, and in looking up Reality and Other Stories, the AI summary in Google. And then I went to various sites since I hadn't read the book and I hadn't seen the story. And the descriptions of the stories by AI were completely different than the descriptions in actual websites. Completely different. The difference was stunning.
I mean, there's an interesting tipping point coming when there's so much, because AI trains on data, public data. As more and more of the internet is written by AIs, then slop, you're going to have AIs training on slop that other AIs created. So although there's an assumption that some of the stuff is going to get better, it doesn't seem to me self-evident.
You're listening to an interview with John Lanchester, whose latest novel is Look What You Made Me Do. I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour. You wrote in one of your essays that your material, things you have written, have been stolen by AI.
Yeah, the Anthropic lawsuit, they found that I've forgotten what the word is, the library, the catalogue of books that were used to train it. So yeah, I think there's 7 or 8 of my books in there.
Ultimately, from your essay on AI, you say that eventually it will just turn into normal tech. It's not going to take everyone's jobs, and it's certainly not going to blow up the world. Where is it going, do you think?
That's my hunch. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball any more than anyone else does. It's not going to take everyone's jobs, but it's definitely already having an impact in a particular kind of white collar work. And I think especially at the sort of entry level jobs, things like, paralegals, training accountants, startup roles in marketing. Some of those have already gone, and noticed that, hirings are down at consultancies, accountancy firms, things like that. One of the things that you have to wonder about that is that, well, if the junior jobs aren't being recruited, where are the seniors of 5 or 10 years time going to be? So for instance, in accounting, the way it works is the juniors, they make their bones going through the books, reading reports. Then after a few years, then they start to interact with, when they really know what they're doing, that's when they interact with customers face to face and talk stuff through. If you haven't got the people doing that, who's going to be doing stuff face to face with clients in 5 years' time? That's already happening. It's not a jobs apocalypse across the whole economy, obviously, but it's a real thing, and it's really affecting the choices people are making already. I mean, one of the weird things is coding, which was the thing 5 years ago. All the tech pros were saying, if someone wanted to be a writer or a journalist, they would say, learn to code. Well, bad luck if you did, because coding is being automated away more quickly than pretty much any other kind of work, because a lot of AI is effectively cut and paste. It's plagiarizing and repeating corpuses of text. Well, that works very well with code, because quite a lot of code is just repeating a corpus of text. And if you were 20 and had just started, or 2 years into a college course in training to be a paralegal, training to be an accountant, training to write code, it would be a very, very unsettling moment.
In that research, in reading those books about Altman and the guy from NVIDIA, what stunned you the most? What did you learn that kind of either made you shiver or made you laugh that you just simply didn't know?
I think one of the things that's quite striking is, having been following this stuff for a while, I remember when Amazon came along in the late 90s. And back in those days, it seems amazing to recall, but it was a book company. They were in the book business.
Right.
And I remember Amazon started rolling out, and I can't remember what the numbers were, but it was losing money every year on year on year, more and more and more money. And there were lots of jokes about it. People used to call it Amazon.bomb. And Bezos, one of his rare flashes of humor, said, his favorite of those jokes was people calling it Amazon.org, because .org is not for profit. And then it comes along, and then it turns out that the thing that Amazon said, which was they were spending all this money on the infrastructure and eventually it would, it would take off like a rocket, turned out to be true. So, okay, it has no profits, but that works out. Eventually it's fine. Okay, and then you have something called, then Google comes along a few years later. And at that point they had no revenue. You had this unbelievably good search engine, which is like a magic thing. And by the way, I think if Google had kept improving at the rate improved from its launch to about 2008, about 3/4 of the use cases for AI wouldn't be coming up, because search had got so good and was so powerful that actually a lot of the things that one uses AI for just would be irrelevant. And Google deliberately broke some of those features, like the ability to find text just by putting quotes around it.
Right.
Using things like plus and minus, what they call Boolean search operators, to find things. There used to be a thing called insight : then the name of a site, and then you'd look for a phrase. And I was just trying to use that today to find something. That used to work magically well, now doesn't work. They deliberately broke it. They broke it in order to make people spend more time on the page, because that works better for advertising revenue. But but then Google they have no revenue at all, because they haven't worked out how to monetize it, but it's still this incredible thing. And then it turns out a few years later, well, that turns into a global behemoth. So, okay, fine. So first we learned that no profits doesn't matter. Second, we learned that no revenue doesn't matter. But the thing in the AI thing, have companies launch and announce a thing, they have a market cap of $10 billion. They have no product. And that's pretty amazing. Okay, we got used to no profit and we got used to no revenue. Now we've got no product. You can still be worth billions. That's pretty amazing, I think. Yeah, what a time to be alive.
In one of your essays, you talk about the war between generations. This generation has this generation has that. My old interviews from the 1990s, all of the research had to go by going to the library. We had to learn to do research. And now, what you were saying before about entry level people learning the basics before they move up, the basics aren't there anymore.
I mean, we both have an interest in SF. I remember we're having an idea for ideally someone else to write, almost like an Arthur C. Clarke thing, that you can imagine a world in which all information is permanently available all the time, which we're not so far away from, or we weren't at one point. What you actually need to do is to train people to think and to how to find things, and that you could have a future in which the education system is actually the classical curriculum, Latin, Greek, and Pythagorean geometry, because that's the only thing that teaches you how to think, that you can't just look up for yourself.
And that could be where you're going with your next novel. Have you started working on one?
No, I've sort of got two ideas on the go that I'm choosing between. My mother is Irish, born in County Mayo in 1920, which was a hard time and place to be born in County Mayo. And she had this expression, which I always thought must be a mordant old Gaelic saying about, talking about the donkey that starved to death because he was between two bales of straw. And then I eventually asked, is that an old Irish saying? He says, no, it's not. I said, well, and so then I asked, well, went to County Mayo, maybe that's an old Mayo saying? Said, nope. And then I asked relatives, well, is that an old family thing? Because my mother's name was Gunnigan. Is that a thing that Gunnigans used to say? Said, nope. So in other words, it was just my mother. That's just my mother's image. It's very in character for her, the donkey. Don't be like the donkey that starves to death because you're between two bales of straw. But I am slightly like that at the moment. I've got two things that I'm kind of trying to choose between. And I keep hoping I'll well, my ideal thing would be to wake up in the morning and find that I had written one. That would be the dream. But failing that, I hope to wake up in the morning and kind of just say, okay, it's B, not A, and then get going.
Have any of your books been adapted for television or film? Do you have options out there?
I have options on a few things. My novel Capital, which is the last but two, was made into a series by the BBC, and it won an International Emmy Award, an International Emmy for Best Miniseries.
You've been listening to an interview with John Lanchester, whose latest novel is Look What You Made Me Do. I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour. coming up now, the second of two theater reviews. According to Google's unreliable AI, nobody beats Dracula as the single most portrayed literary character in film history, with over 200 direct adaptations, parodies, and crossover appearances. You can add the hundreds of theatrical versions floating around as well. Due to a screw-up in the 19th century, Dracula has always been in the public domain in the United States. And there's also the whole vampire thing. Vlad Tepes, Anne Rice, The Lost Boys. In 2020, following a flurry of Jane Austen adaptations, playwright Kate Hamill chose to take a bite out of Bram Stoker, and thus we have Dracula, a feminist revenge fantasy, really. Yes, that's the title, which now runs at San Francisco Playhouse through June 27th. This Dracula hews to the beats of the Stoker novel, and at the same time turns it upside down. Dracula is not merely a monster, he's the archetype of toxic masculinity, particularly as muscularly and scarily performed by Johnny Moreno. Renfield, rather Mrs. Renfield, the fly-eating comic lunatic, played here in an indelible performance by Stacey Ross, is the night's most tragic victim, the rejected female child yearning for daddy. After a brief prologue, the show opens at the doors of Dracula's castle in Transylvania, where estate agent Jonathan Harker, in a physical performance by James Aaron O that runs from torment to slapstick, he meets up with the titular vampire and his vampire wives, who are themselves victim of a misogynist society. Then we move on to the main story involving Jonathan's wife Mina, an engaging Sharon Shao, and her friend Lucy, a feisty Nema Adeni. She's a proto-feminist planning to marry for security, certainly not love, and her fiancé, the staid anti-feminist Dr. Seward of the asylum, a deliberately stiff Josh Shell. And then we meet Dr. Van Helsing, in a cowboy hat, played with gusto by Susie Damilano, and all the elements fall into place. It's to director Bill English's credit that Dracula stays most of the time on a tightrope between Victorian melodrama, horror, and camp. The laughter is uneasy, the pathos over the top, and the violence pretty graphic. While the subject may be fear, and the subtext dealing with the evils of traditional masculinity, this is a fearless production with an impeccable cast, if you don't mind the viscera. Dracula, a feminist revenge fantasy, really, by Kate Hamill, plays at San Francisco Playhouse through June 27th, and for more information, you can go to sfplayhouse.org. Until next week, I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Bookwaves, Artwaves Hour.
American civil rights advocate and a scholar of critical race theory and intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw.
The moment that Clarence Thomas was finally confirmed, I said, this is going to change the rest of our lives. Luke said, all because they refused to believe a black woman. I call this a massive intersectional failure. When we look at some of the consequences of that failure, some of the long-term results of that, we've lost campaign finance reform on a 5-4 vote. We lost Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, 5-4 votes. We look at all the 5-4 votes that were made possible by that failure to believe Anita Hill, and we have to recognize that this intersectional failure not only impacts black women, not only impacts communities of color, it undermined the security and the democracy of the entire nation.
Storytelling for social change, only on KPFA.
KPFA, KPFK, KPFT, WPFW, and WBAI are part of the listener-supported Pacifica Radio Network, one of the few media organizations in the country with democratically elected boards. A donation of $25 or more between July 1st, 2025 and June 30th, 2026 makes you a voting member. That means you can help elect representatives to local station boards and the Pacifica National Board, helping guide outreach, fundraising, and the future direction of the network. To become a voting member, donate through your station's website before June 30th. For more information, visit elections.pacifica.org.
You're tuned in to 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online at kpfa.org.